Hello, YouTube. This morning we are beginning the book of Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation. We've read through the introductory remarks, and I believe we'll start with the preface, other than the contents of Volume 1, preface to the first edition, second edition, third edition, first book. The World as Representation, first consideration. Representation subject to the principle of sufficient reason, the object of experience and science. Second book, The World as Will, first consideration, the objectivation of the will. Third book, The World as Representation, second consideration, representation independent of the principle of sufficient reason, the Platonic idea, the object of art. Fourth book, The World as Will, second consideration, with the achievement of self-knowledge. Affirmation and negation of the will to life, appendix critique of the Kantian philosophy. And I did forget to read this. 4 books with an appendix containing the critique of the Kantian philosophy. Ob nicht Natur zuletzt sich doch Grande Gautier. Might not nature finally fathom itself? From a poem to Stadtminister von Voigt, 27th of September 1816. Also translated as, is it not nature that finally finds its way? Might not nature finally fathom itself? Preface to the first edition. What I propose to do here is to specify how this book is to be read so as to be understood. I'm smoking as well, so. It aims to convey a single thought, footnote 2. It is 2. I'll just get that a bit closer. No, A. Gedanke. But in spite of all my efforts, I could not find a shorter way of conveying the thought than the whole of this book. I believe it is the idea that people have sought out for such a long time under the heading of philosophy, which is why scholars of history have thought it to be as impossible to discover as the philosopher's stone, although Pliny had already told them how much has been considered impossible before it has been done. Natural History 7IB. And that's that in Latin by the looks of it. As this one thought is considered from different sides, it reveals itself respectively as what has been called metaphysics, what has been called ethics, and what has been called aesthetics. And it is only natural that it be all of these, if it really is what I claim it to be. A system of thoughts must always have an architectonic coherence. German. i.e., that is, a coherence in which one part always supports another without the second supporting the first. So the foundation stone will ultimately support all the parts without itself being supported by any of them, and the summit will be supported without itself supporting anything. A single thought, on the other hand, however comprehensive it might be, must perceive the most perfect unity. If it is divided up in order to be communicated, the various parts must still be organically coherent, that is, each part containing the whole just as much as it is contained by the whole, with no part first and no part last, the whole thought rendered more distinct through each part, and even the smallest part incapable of being fully understood without a prior understanding of the whole. But a book must have a first line and a last, and to this extent will always be very different from an organism, however similar they might be in content. As a result, form and matter are in contradiction here. In circumstances such as this, it is evident that the only way to completely fathom the thought presented here is to read the book twice. And in fact, with considerable patience the first time, the sort of patience that only comes from a voluntary conviction that the beginning presupposes the end almost as much as the end presupposes the beginning. And similarly, that all the earlier parts presuppose the later ones, almost as much as the later ones presuppose the earlier. I say almost because this is by no means unconditionally so, and anything that could be done to give priority to what is explained only in the sequel, just as in general, whatever could facilitate comprehensibility and clarity has been honestly and conscientiously done. Indeed, I might have succeeded to some extent if it were not for the reader who, in reading the book, thinks not only of what is being said, but, which is only natural, of its possible consequences as well. As a result, the many places where the book really is in conflict with the opinions of the age, and presumably with those of the reader as well, can be joined by just as many more anticipated and imaginary points of conflict, so that what is in fact only a misunderstanding must look like lively disapproval. And although the painstakingly attained clarity of presentation and expression leaves no question about the immediate meaning of what is said, such clarity cannot at the same time elucidate the relation between what is being said and everything else, which further exacerbates the problem. This is why the first reading requires, as I said, a patience that comes from the confidence that a second reading will put many things, if not everything, in a very different light. As to the rest, my serious attempts to render a very difficult topic, fully and even easily comprehensible must justify occasional repetition. Even the structure of the whole, which is organic rather than chain-like, sometimes forces me to touch on the same point twice. This very structure, as well as the extremely close connections between all parts, has not allowed me to divide the work into chapters and paragraphs, a division I otherwise find very valuable, but has instead required me to leave it in four main parts, four perspectives, as it were, on the one thought. In each of these four books, the reader must be particularly careful not to lose sight of the principal thought in the associated details that need to be treated along with it, or of the progress of the presentation as a whole. This, like the demands to follow, is absolutely essential for the hostile reader. Hostile, that is, to the philosopher, because he is one himself. I should start when I've finished the cigarette. The second demand is that the introduction be read before the book itself, even though it is not located inside the book, but rather appeared 5 years earlier under the title On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, a philosophical essay. It is absolutely impossible to truly understand the present work unless the reader is familiar with this introduction and propadeutic. I've not seen that word before. Check. Which loss of validity, failure, finding opening dictionary. Orpadeutic, orpadeutic, because it's not spelled like that. E-U-T-I-C, not there. So we'll go to the old Google, have a look. Of an area of study serving as a preliminary instruction or as an introduction to further study, an introduction to a subject or area of study. Orpadeutic, orpadeutic. There we go. I'll see if it, why isn't it letting me get the etymology? Let me see if it's down here. No, have I not got it open? Yeah. Let me see, where are we? It is impossible. Absolutely impossible. I haven't read it, but I've read the introduction to this text, which goes into it a little bit. It is absolutely impossible to truly understand the present work unless the reader is familiar with its introduction and propadeutic, its introduction and propadeutic, introduction to an area of study. And the contents of this essay are presupposed here as much as if they had been included in the book. Moreover, if the essay had not preceded the present work by several years, it would be incorporated into the first book instead of standing in front of it as an introduction. There are gaps in the first book where the material from that essay would have been, and the resulting incompleteness must be made good by constant appeal to that essay. But I have such a strong aversion to copying myself or struggling to find new words for what was said quite adequately in the first that I preferred this method, despite the fact that I could now present the material in that essay rather better, particularly by cleansing it of many concepts that stem from my then excessive entanglement with the Kantian philosophy, concepts such as categories, outer and inner sense, and the like. Yet those concepts are there only because I had never really engaged with them on a very profound level, and thus only as side issues that do not touch on the main subject. This is why the reader who is familiar with the present work will automatically correct those passages in the essay. But only after the reader has fully recognised by means of this essay what the principle of sufficient reason is and means, where it is valid and where it is not, the fact that it is not prior to all things and the whole world does not exist only in consequence of and according to this principle as something like its correlate. Only after the reader has fully recognised that this principle is really nothing more than a form, the form in which an object, which is always conditioned by the subject, only after the reader has fully recognised that this principle is really nothing more than the form of which an object of whatever sort it may be is always cognised, so long as the subject is a cognising individual, only then is it possible to grasp the method of philosophising that is attempted here for the first time, and that is utterly distinct from all previous methods. The object is always conditioned by the subject. The same aversion to repeating myself verbatim or even saying the same thing a second time with different and less suitable words, having already used all the better ones, this aversion is solely responsible for another gap in the first book of this work, since I have omitted everything written in the first chapter of my essay on vision and colours, which otherwise would have belonged here word for word. So a familiarity with this short earlier writing is also presupposed. I haven't read that either. And it didn't say much about it in the introduction. Finally, the third demand made of the reader could even have been left unstated, because it is nothing less than an acquaintance with the most important phenomenon to emerge in philosophy over the past 2,000 years, one that lies so close to us. I'm talking about the principal works of Kant. I find that the effect of these works on the mind to which they truly speak is, as already been said elsewhere, comparable to a cataract operation on a blind person. And if we were to continue this comparison, my aim can be described as wanting to put cataract glasses into the hands of those who have successfully had this operation, since the operation is the most necessary condition for the use of those glasses. However much I take the achievements of the great Kant as my point of departure, a serious study of his works has nonetheless enabled me to discover significant errors, and I have had to separate those errors out and show them to be unsound, so that I could then presuppose and apply what is true and excellent in his theories in a pure form, freed from those errors. So as not to interrupt and confuse my own discussion by frequent polemical remarks directed against Kant, I've put those into a special appendix. And my writing presupposes a familiarity with this appendix just as much as it presupposes, as I have said, a familiarity with the Kantian philosophy. So with this in mind, it is advisable to read the appendix first, and all the more so because its content refers directly to the first book of the present work. On the other hand, given the nature of the material, the appendix inevitably makes occasional reference to the work itself. But all that follows from this is that it needs to be read twice, just like the main part of the work. Thus, for the purpose of my discussion, I do not presuppose that the reader has a complete knowledge of any philosophy besides that of Kant. But if, in addition, the reader has spent time in the school of the divine Plato, then he will be that much more prepared for and receptive to what I have to say. And if she has even shared in the blessing of the Vedas, which have been made accessible to us through the Upanishads, and which, to my mind, is the chief advantage that this still young century enjoys over the previous one. And in fact, I expect the influence of the Sanskrit literature to have as profound an effect on us as the revival of Greek literature had on the 15th century. So, as I was saying, if the reader has also already received and been receptive to the consecration of the ancient Indian wisdom, then he will be in the very position to hear what I have to say to her. It will not strike her as it will strike many others, as foreign or even inimical, tending to obstruct or harm, unfriendly, hostile. Late 16th century, from the late Latin inimicalis, from Latin inimicus, say enemy. It will not strike her as it will strike many others as foreign or even inimical, since I would like to claim, as it does not sound arrogant, that each of the individual and disconnected remarks that form the Upanishads could be derived as a corollary of the thoughts I will be imparting, although conversely, my thoughts certainly cannot be found there. But most readers will have already felt their impatience mounting and will have broken out into a rebuke that has been held back for some time with considerable effort. How dare I put a book before the public under demands and conditions, the first two of which are presumptuous and completely unreasonable, and this at a time when there is such a general abundance of distinctive thoughts that the press makes 3,000 such thoughts into common property each year in Germany alone in the form of estimable, is that estimable? Estimable, worthy of great respect, estimable. Spelled with an I, is it? Late 15th century, from the sense able to be estimated or appraised. Earlier in estimable, from Old French, from Latin. Estimabilis, estime, to estimate, to estimate. Estimable, with worthy of great respect. And this at a time when there is such a general abundance of distinctive thoughts that the press makes 3,000 such thoughts into common property each year in Germany alone, and in the form of estimable, original and completely indispensable works, as well as in countless periodicals and even the daily papers. Particularly at a time when there is no lack of wholly original and profound philosophers, and in fact there are more of them living simultaneously in Germany alone than during the course of several centuries together. How, the indignant reader might ask, will there ever be an end to it if we have to do so much work for a single book? Since I have absolutely nothing to say to such reproaches, I can only hope for some gratitude on the part of those readers for having warned them in time so that they do not waste a single hour with a book that it would be useless to read without fulfilling the stated demands, and thus must be left entirely alone. This is particularly true since it is a fairly good bet that the book can have nothing to say to them, that it will only ever be a matter of a few men, and thus must wait calmly and modestly for the few whose uncommon way of thinking will find it palatable. Because even apart from its intricacies and wealth of detail, as well as the exertions that it expects of the reader, what well-informed person of this age, whose knowledge has approached the marvellous point where the paradoxical is the same as the false, could bear to encounter thoughts on almost every page that frankly contradict those that he himself had put down as true and established once and for all? And then how unpleasantly disappointed people will be when they find absolutely no mention of the things that they believe they must look for here in particular, because their way of speculating coincides with that of a still living great philosopher. F.J. Jacobi. I don't know where 2 is, but I don't want to go to it. Oh. Coincides with that of a still living great philosopher who has written truly touching books and has only the small weakness of considering everything that he has learned and approved of before his 15th year as the innate and fundamental thoughts of the human spirit. Who wants to put up with all this? So my advice is simply to put down the book, But I'm afraid that even this will not let me off the hook. The reader who has come so far as the preface only to be rebuffed by it has paid good money for the book and wants to know how he can be compensated. My last resort now is to remind him that he knows other things to do with a book besides reading it. It can fill a space in his library as well as any other book, and it will look quite good there with its fresh, clean binding, or he can leave it in the dressing room or on the tea table of his educated lady friend. Or finally, by far the best option of all, and one that I would particularly advise, is for him to write a review of it. And so, after allowing myself this stroke and in this thoroughly ambiguous life, there is hardly any page too serious to grant it a place. I offer up this book with profound seriousness and in the firm conviction that sooner or later it will reach those to whom alone it can be addressed. And as to the rest, I'm calmly resigned to the fact that it will fully share the fate that truth has met with in every branch of knowledge, and most of all, where the knowledge is most important, that of being granted only a short victory celebration between the two long periods of time when it is condemned as paradoxical or disparaged as trivial. The author of the truth usually meets with the first fate as well. But life is short and the reach of truth is long and long-lived. Let us speak the truth. Written in Dresden, 1818, footnote 3. Now I'll just go to those footnote situations and I'll split this down. And will this get me there at least? And first place. Okay, this bit, where's your notes, mate? That was told. I was told that. Now, whose notes are they? Is this good? No notes now, so I'll just go back up to this. I'll take me a while, so I'll just go scooting up like that. What do you mean, no heading? Editorial notes and references. 3 kinds of notes occur in the translation. Footnotes marked with asterisks are Schopenhauer's own notes. Footnotes marked with letters are editorial notes. These ever give or imagine all footnotes material not in brackets consist in words from the original text. Footnotes marked with numerals. The endnotes are placed in the back of the book and indicate variations between texts of the original essays during Schopenhauer's lifetime. Do I want to read them? 567, 567, index. I'm terribly sorry about this technical issues we're having at the moment, where I haven't found the right spot. There we go. A, B, capitalised. And it is 1 and 2. You're trying to confuse me, aren't you? There we go. 1, 2. In A and B. Footnote added in C. Written in added in B. Footnote added in C. The second and third editions. I don't care. I don't care. Just Just, oh, look at that. Back down here. This bit. Second edition. All righty. Just have this last sip of my coffee. Should really smoke. Drink some water. There's not much water either. Should be coming all prepared. Preface to the second edition. It is not to my contemporaries, it is not to my compatriots, it is to humanity itself that I entrust my now completed work, in the confidence that humanity will find some value in it, even if this value will only gain recognition belatedly, this being the inevitable fate of all good things. It can only be for humanity, not for the generation that hurries past, caught up in the delusions of the moment, that my mind has unceasingly devoted itself to its work, almost against my will, throughout the course of a long life. Even the lack of interest, Hegelian philosophy, even the lack of interest could not shake my faith in its value during this time. I constantly saw the false, the bad, and finally the absurd and nonsensical, Hegelian philosophy, enjoying general admiration and esteem, and reflected that if people who know how to recognise what is genuine and true were not so rare as to be sought in vain for 20 years together, then those who are able to produce it would not be so few that their works afterwards constitute an exception to the transitory nature of earthly things, so that we would lose the comforting prospect of prosperity, which constitutes a necessary source of strength for everyone with a lofty goal. Nobody who seriously takes on and pursues a problem that does not result in material advantage can count on the sympathy of his contemporaries, but in the meantime he will usually see the semblance of such a problem becoming accepted in the world and having its stay, and this is as it should be. The problem itself must be pursued for its own sake, or else it will fail, because intent is always dangerous to insight. Indeed, the whole of the history of literature testifies to the fact that everything worthwhile takes a long time to gain currency, particularly if its nature is instructive and not entertaining, and in the meanwhile, falseness glitters and gleams. It is difficult, if not impossible, to unite the problem with the semblance of the problem. But this is just the curse of this world of misery and need. Everything must serve and slave for them. The world is not built to permit any noble or sublime striving, such as striving towards light and truth, to thrive unchecked or to exist for its own sake. Rather, even if something like this could ever assert itself and its idea be thus introduced, material interests and personal goals will overpower it immediately and turn it into their own tool or mask. Accordingly, after Kant gave renewed prestige to philosophy, it was not long before this too had to become the instrument of different goals, of state goals from above and personal ones from below. Even if this was not philosophy in the strict sense, it was nonetheless its lookalike and past for philosophy. This should come as no surprise to us, because the vast majority of people are constitutionally incapable of entertaining any goals except material ones, and cannot even imagine any other kind. This is why to strive after truth alone is much too lofty and eccentric an aspiration than can be expected to arouse the sincere interest or real sympathy of all people, many people, or even just a few people. If nevertheless you see a remarkable spirit of activity, such as in Germany at the moment, a general bustle, people discussing and writing about matters philosophical, you can confidently assume that the actual first mover, the hidden driving force behind this activity, notwithstanding solemn looks and assurances, is in fact real and not ideal goals. Specifically, it is personal, official, ecclesiastical, political, and in short, material interests that people have in view. Consequently, it is purely partisan interests that set the many pens of these supposed sages so powerfully into motion and so intent, not insight, as the guiding star for these noisemakers, and truth is really the last thing they have on their minds. The truth does not find partisans, rather it can make its way through this sort of philosophical melee as calmly and inconspicuously as though the winter night of the darkest century that was held captive by the most rigid church doctrines, where the truth was communicated like the esoteric doctrine of a few adepts or even entrusted to parchment alone. I'll just read that again. The truth does not find partisans. Rather, it can make its way through this sort of philosophical melee as calmly and inconspicuously as through the winter night of the darkest century that was held captive by the most rigid church doctrines, where the truth was communicated like the esoteric doctrine of a few adepts or even entrusted to parchment alone. It can make its way through this sort of philosophical melee or entrusted to parchment alone. In fact, I would say that no age can be less propitious. Oh, come on. Why are you not letting me? Oh, I don't care. I just want to check its definition. Why are you not letting me now? You let me earlier. Where's my dictionary? Where's my dictionary gone? Is that it? No, it's preview dictionary. It's because it was closed or something. Done that. Propitious. Propitious. Giving or indicating a good chance of success, favorably disposed towards someone. Late Middle Old French, propitious, from Latin propitious, favourable, gracious, giving or indicating good chance of success, favourable, less favourable. In fact, I would say that no age can be less favourable for philosophy than one in which it is shamefully misused as an instrument of the state on one side and as a meal ticket on the other. Or do people really think that, given these sorts of aspirations and this sort of turmoil, the truth, which is not even at issue here, will somehow come to light? Truth is not a prostitute who throws her arms around the necks of people who do not want her. To the contrary, she is such a coy beauty that even someone who has sacrificed everything to her cannot be certain of her favours. That's right. Truth used to be a woman, didn't it? Pandora? Now, if governments make philosophy into the instrument of state goals, scholars, on the other hand, see a professorship of philosophy as an occupation that puts dinner on the table, just like any other occupation. So they glamour after this occupation in the assurance of their own good disposition, that is, their intention to serve that goal. And they are as good as their word, not truth, not clarity, not Plato, not Aristotle, but rather the aims that they are meant to serve as are their guiding star and instantly become the criterion of what is true, valuable, worthy of consideration, and of its opposite. So something that does not correspond to these aims, even if it is the most important and the most extraordinary achievement in their field, will either be condemned or, where this seems dangerous, suffocated by being collectively ignored, just as their unanimous zeal in opposition to pantheism, just look at their unanimous zeal in opposition to pantheism. That's more than one God? Or is it just pan, God? I'll just double check, and I'll have to do it this way now. How bloody annoying. You know? I don't know whether you can see it when I pop that up there. That's not my dictionary. That's me. Please explain when I'm having trouble. The doctrine which identifies God with the universe or regards the universe as a manifestation of God, the worship or tolerance of many gods. So what do you mean? Do you mean many gods or one God? Early 18th century from Pan, all Greek, theos, God, ism. I don't know. Early 18th century. It's around 1700s, right? Pantheism. It's undecidable. Does it alter the way we interpret the text? Just look at their unanimous zeal in opposition to many gods. Will any fool believe that it comes from genuine conviction? When philosophy is degraded into a money-earning trade, how could it fail to denigrate into sophistry? Precisely because there's a question I'm going to see whether it's answered at the Para Academia FOPA, Festival of Para Academia, that's coming up tomorrow and today and the next day in Melbourne. Just look, when philosophy is degraded into mere money-making trade, how could it fail to denigrate into sophistry? I've had that experience as well. Precisely because this is inevitable and the rule, he who pays the piper picks the tune, has always held true. The ancients considered earning money from philosophy to be the mark of a sophist. Now, in addition, since nothing but mediocrity can be expected, demanded, or purchased for money in this world, we must resign ourselves to this fact even here. Accordingly, in all the German universities, we see good old mediocrity struggling to create a philosophy that does not yet even remotely exist, using its own resources, but accepting a prescribed standard and goal. It would be almost cruel to make fun of such a spectacle. For a long time, philosophy has been obliged to serve as a means to public ends on the one hand and to private ends on the other. Meanwhile, I have been pursuing my own train of thought for more than 30 years, undisturbed by all this, just because it is what I must do, and I could not do otherwise, out of an instinctive drive, which is nonetheless supported by the confidence that what is thought truly and what throws light on obscurity will be grasped at some point by another thinking mind. It will appeal to him and give him pleasure and comfort. You speak to a mind like this, just as we have been spoken to by those similar to us, who have become our consolation in this wasteland of life. In the meantime, we must pursue our problems for their own sake and on their own. But it is a strange fact that philosophical meditations, that only what someone has thought through and investigated for himself can later be of use to someone else, not what was intended for others from the start. That's a good little. I just want to remember that, so I'll just do this and paste it here. But it is a strange fact about philosophical meditations that only what someone has thought through and investigated for himself can be of later use to someone else, not what was intended for others from the start. The former has the recognisable character of complete honesty, because people are not trying to fool themselves or offer themselves empty shells. This banishes all sophistications and verbiage, and so every sentence immediately repays the effort it takes to read it. Accordingly, my writings carry the stamp of honesty and openness so clearly and candidly that this in itself puts them in stark contrast with the three famous sophists of the post-Kantian period. I can always be found on the standpoint of reflection, that is, of rational deliberation and honest exchange of ideas, never on that of inspiration, which is called intellectual intuition or even absolute thought, but whose true names are drivel and charlatanism. So, working in this spirit, and all the while seeing the false and the bad enjoying universal prestige, and in fact windbags, dronings, and charlatanism held in the highest honour, I have long since renounced the approbation of my contemporaries. Okay, I'll just get that as well. Copy. Approbation. Dictionary. Approbation. Approval or praise. Late Middle English via French from Latin. Approbation, from the verb approbere, from approbate. I'll have a look at that. Approve formally. Sanction. Sanction can be either, can't it? And it can be a bad thing as well. Late Middle English from Latin approbate, approved, from the verb approbere, from add to plus bear, probare, try, test, from probus, good. Sanction, a threatened penalty for disobeying a law or rule, official permission or approval for an action. I got a sanction. I was a bit confused what it was about. Where was I? So, working in this spirit, and all the while seeing the false and the bad enjoying universal prestige, and in fact windbags, dronings, and charlatanism held in the highest honour. And I've long since renounced the approbation of my contemporaries, the praise. For 20 long years, these contemporaries have hailed a Hegel, this intellectual Caliban, as the greatest of philosophers, and indeed so loudly that it resounded throughout Europe. It is impossible for someone who has seen this to covert their approbation. Caliban. I don't know whether it's got the same copy. Check. 1, 2, 2, check. 1, 1, 2. Caliban. No. No. What's Caliban? Google? No, I did not mean that. Caliban. Wikipedia. Caliban, the subhuman son of the sea witch Sycorax, is an important character in William Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Here we go. What does Caliban symbolise? What does Caliban represent? Caliban represents a colonised figure, and Prospero is the coloniser. Caliban is the only creature that is native to the island where Prospero and Miranda live. Prospero first shows interest in the island and then he enslaves Caliban. All right, so for 20 long years, these contemporaries have hailed Hegel, this intellectual colonised figure, as the greatest intellectual. Maybe it has a different thing. Let me see, is Caliban good or evil? Caliban is the main antagonist in the 1611 Shakespeare play, The Tempest. He's the character, he's the son of Sycorax and the devil. Okay. And lived on the island before the story's main character, Prospero, came with his daughter and claimed the land for their own. Who is the real villain in The Tempest? While many viewers of the play may be quick to suggest that The Tempest's villain is perhaps the usurper of the throne, Prospero's brother Antonio, or the ungrateful monster, Prospero's servant, Caliban, a close read reveals that Prospero himself is the true villain, but not even in the obvious sense. Is the Tempest racist? Prospero even calls Caliban my slave. And the many epitaphs flung at Caliban, monster, man monster, misshapen knave, tortoise, fish, mooncalf, and so on, have been challenged by generations of scholars and audiences for their racist language. Who is the demon? Who is the real hero of Macbeth? No. What is the main message of The Tempest? There are many themes in The Tempest. Explore the main themes of freedom, empathy and forgiveness, and nature versus nurture, just at how they affect characters and influence the story. Caliban, the heir or twin kingdom ascends. No, that's Warframe. All right. This intellectual slave, as the greatest of philosophers, and indeed so loudly that it resounded throughout Europe, it is impossible for someone who has seen this to covert their approbation. Is that agreed? It's not working. Copy. Covet dictionary. Covet, yearn to possess something, especially something belonging to another. Covetable, Middle English from Old French. Cuvetier, based on Latin. Cupiditas, cupidity. yearn to possess. Cupidity, greed for money or possessions. Late Middle English from Old French, cupidite, from Latin cupidatus, cupiditus, from cupidus, desirous, from cupere, to desire, compare, covert, covet, desire their appropriation. It is impossible for someone who has seen this to desire their praise. They have no more wreaths of honour to bestow. Their approbation has been prostituted, and their censure means nothing. That means in their censure, their approbation has been prostituted. They're prostituted, sold. Their what do you call it? Praise has been sold, and their praise means nothing. I can prove that I am serious about this, because if I were really after the approbation of my contemporaries, I would have had to cross out some 20 pages that totally contradict all their views and in fact must be somewhat offensive to them. But I would think it a dereliction on my part to sacrifice even a syllable for the sake of such approbation. Dereliction. Now that's like like not doing something you should. Eh? No. A dereliction. Yeah. It's like doing a tardy, doing something very badly. Yeah. I'll just check. Dereliction. I've got a hot flush happening. The state of having been abandoned or become dilapidated, dereliction of duty, the shameful failure to fulfill one's obligations. From late 16th century, from Latin dereliction, from the verb dereliquere, derelict. Okay, derelict. Very poor condition as a result of disuse or neglect, shameful neglect of one's duties or obligations. That's the one. From late Latin, derelictus, abandoned, past participle of dereliquere, from de, completely, to relinquere, forsake. There we go. But I would think it a dereliction on my part to sacrifice even a syllable for the sake of such approbation. My own guiding star has in all seriousness been the truth. To follow this, I had to begin by thinking only of self-approbation, resolutely turning my back on an age that has sunk far when it comes to all higher intellectual pursuits, and a national literature that has been demoralised but for the exceptions, and in which the art of combining lofty expressions with lowly sentiments has reached a new high. Of course, like everyone else, I can never escape the mistakes and weaknesses inherent in my nature, but I will not increase them with unworthy accommodations. Now, as far as this second edition is concerned, I am pleased, first of all, that after 25 years I can find nothing to retract, and thus that my fundamental convictions have proved their worth, at least as far as I am concerned. The changes to the first volume, which contains only the text of the first edition, never touch on what is essential, but rather concern only secondary matters, and consists for the most part of short explanatory addenda, added additions that have been inserted here and there. Only in the critique of the Kantian philosophy are there significant corrections and lengthy additions, because these could not be put into a supplementary book, as was the case with the 4 books presenting my own teachings, where each book received a supplement in the 2nd volume. This supplementary volume is my preferred method for adding to and improving each book, because the 25 years that have passed since they were written have made such a noticeable difference in my mode of presentation and tone of delivery that I could not really merge the content of the 2nd volume with that of the 1st into a unified whole, since such a fusion would be detrimental to both. So I offer the 2 works separately and have often failed to change the earlier presentation at even those points where I would now express myself in an entirely different fashion. This is because I did not want to spoil the work of my younger years with the fault-finding of age. Whatever might stand in need of correction in this respect will rectify itself automatically in the reader's mind with the help of the 2nd volume. Each volume supplements the other in the full sense of the term, namely to the extent that this is due to one phase of a human life being an intellectual supplement to the other. Consequently, you will not only find each volume containing something the other does not, but you will also find that the advantages of the one consist in precisely what is lacking in the other. Thus, if the advantage of the first half of my work over the second lies in what only the fervour of youth and the energy of a first conception can bring, then the second half will surpass the first in the maturity and complete elaboration of the ideas, since these are fruits that follow only from a long life and much hard work. When I had the strength originally to grasp the basic idea of my system, to follow it immediately through its 4 ramifications, to return from these to the unity of the trunk from which these 4 branches emerge, and then to give a clear presentation of the whole, I could not then be in a position to elaborate all the parts of the system with the completeness, thoroughness, and detail that can only be attained by meditating on it over the course of many years. Such meditations are required to test it out and illustrate it with countless facts, to support it with the greatest variety of proofs, to shed light on it from all angles, and then to place the different points of view into bold contrast in order to clearly separate the diversity of materials and put them into an orderly arrangement. So, although it would certainly be more pleasant to the reader to have my entire work in one piece rather than having it consist, as it does now, of 2 halves to be used together, the reader should take into account the fact that this would have required me to accomplish in one period of life what is possible only in 2, since I would have needed to possess in a single period of life all the qualities that nature divided into 2 very different periods. Accordingly, the need to deliver my work in 2 mutually supplementary halves can be compared to the necessity that requires an achromatic object glass, which cannot be made from a single piece. Achromatic. All right, I'll just pause there and I'll just get that. Copy. Achromatic object glass. Dictionary. Paste. resulting to using or denoting lenses that transmit light without separating into constituent colours, without colour, literary. Mid-18th century, from Greek achromatos, colourless, from a without chromat, colour, ick. Achromatic lens, a lens that transmits light without separating it into its constituent colours. All right, so object glass. Accordingly, the need to deliver my work in two mutually supplementary halves can be compared to the necessity that requires an achromatic object glass, which cannot be made from a single piece, to be constructed by combining a convex lens of crown glass with a concave lens of flint glass, which only together produce the desired effect. All right, then. I get it. It's just a metaphor, so it's okay. I get it. I don't know exactly. I know I can picture that, but I don't know what a flint and a crown glass do, but that doesn't matter. Still, the reader will be compensated to some extent for the inconvenience of using two volumes simultaneously by the variety and diversion that comes when the same topic is treated by the same person in the same spirit, but at very different ages. Did you rewrite the whole book again? Or did you just add bits to the second edition, which means we don't need to read them both? In the meantime, I would strongly advise people who are unfamiliar with my philosophy to begin with the first volume without getting drawn into the supplements, and to use these only in a second reading. Otherwise, it would be too difficult for them to grasp the coherence of the system, which only the first volume presents, while the principal doctrines are justified more fully and developed completely on their own in the second. Even someone who has not decided whether to read the first volume twice will do better to read the second volume on its own, only after having read the first. She can do this by reading the chapters in order, since there is certainly a connection between the chapters of the second volume, albeit a looser one, and any gaps can be filled completely by recalling the first volume, provided this has been understood fully. Moreover, the reader will find references everywhere pointing back to the relevant pages in the first volume. This is why in the second edition of the first volume, I numbered the sections which were separated only by lines in the first edition. I have already explained in the preface of the first edition that my philosophy takes Kant as its point of departure and thus presupposes a thorough familiarity with that philosophy. I will reiterate that here. Kant's teaching so fundamentally alters every mind that has grasped it, that it can be considered an intellectual rebirth. It is the only thing capable of truly eliminating the inherent realism that comes from the original constitution of the intellect. Neither Berkeley nor Malebranche could accomplish this because they remain too strictly with the universal, while Kant enters into the particular, and indeed in a way that has neither precedent nor successor. This results in an entirely idiosyncratic, one might say immediate, effect on the mind, which is then thoroughly disabused and henceforth sees everything in a new light. Only this will make the mind receptive to the more positive explanations I have to give. On the other hand, people who have not mastered Kant's philosophy are, whatever else they might have done, in something like a state of innocence, namely caught in that natural and childish realism into which we are all born and which makes everything possible for us except philosophy. Consequently, this type of person is to the first what a minor is to a child. The fact that this truth sounds paradoxical today, which would certainly not have been the case in the first 30 years after the appearance of the Critique of Reason, is due to the fact that a generation has grown up in the meantime that is not familiar with Kant, having read him quickly and impatiently, or having heard only a second-hand report. This, again, is due to the fact that the generation has been instructed poorly and, as a result, has wasted its time with the philosophemes of ordinary and, therefore, officious minds. I don't know that word. Officious, official, something like that. It's got official in it, hasn't it? Or office. Yes, asserting an authority in a domineering way, especially with regard to trivial matters. Intrusively enthusiastic in offering help or advice, interfering. Late 15th century, from Latin officiosus, obliging, from officium, office. The original sense was performing its function, officiacius, whence ready to help or please, mid-16th century, later becoming depreciatory, late 16th century. I'm just going to have a look at office. Room, a position of authority, usually offices, service done for another or others, Christian, divine office, offices, part of the house, work is done, usually offices. Office, Middle English, Old French, from Latin officium, performance of a task. In medieval Latin, also office, divine service, based on opus, work, and facere, do. All right, officious, obliging, therefore obliging in a derogatory meaning. This, again, is due to the fact that the generation has been instructed poorly and, as a result, has wasted its time with the philosophemes of ordinary and, therefore, obliging minds, or even those of the windbag sophists who were irresponsibly recommended to it. This explains the confusion with first concepts and, in general, the unspeakable crudity and crassness that peers out from under the shell of affectation and pretension. Affectation, state of being an affect, in a state of affect. I don't know. Behaviour, speech, or writing that is pretentious and designed to impress. A studied display of real or pretending feeling. Affect sense too. Pretentious, designed to impress. Pretend or have or feel something, to use where or something pretentiously, or so as to make an impression on others. Pretentious. This explains the confusion with first concepts and, in general, the unspeakable crudity and crassness that peers out from under the shell of pretension, affectation, and pretension in the philosophical efforts of the generation raised in this way. Anyone who thinks he can get to know Kant's philosophy from other people's accounts has made a terrible mistake. In fact, I would seriously warn people against accounts of this kind, particularly the more recent ones. And in these past few years, I have come across descriptions of Kantian philosophy in the works of Hegelians that have entered the realm of complete fantasy. How could minds that have been disfigured and spoiled by Hegelian nonsense, while still in the freshness of youth, remain capable of following Kant's profound investigations? They have been accustomed from early on to mistake the hollowest verbiage for philosophical ideas, the most miserable sophisms for sagacity, childish absurdities for dialectic, and their heads have been muddled by absorbing crazed word combinations, which torture and exhaust the mind that tries in vain to extract some meaning from them. Minds like these do not need a critique of reason. They do not need philosophy. First, they need a medicine for the mind as a purgative, something like a short course in common sensology. And then we must wait and see whether there can ever be talk of philosophy with them. It is futile to look for Kant's doctrine outside of Kant's own works, but these are thoroughly instructive, even where he is wrong, even where he's mistaken. His originality ensures that what holds for all real philosophers holds for him as well, and in the highest degree. You can get to know them only through their own writings, not through other people's accounts. This is because the thoughts of these extraordinary spirits cannot withstand filtration through a common mind, born behind the broad, tall, beautifully arched brows, from under which radiant eyes shine forth. They lose all strength and all life and no longer look like themselves when transplanted into the narrow dwellings and low housing of the narrow, depressed, thick-walled skulls where dull gazers peer out towards personal ends. We can even say that such heads act like uneven mirrors in which everything is twisted and distorted. Things lose the regular proportions of their beauty and present a grimace. You can receive philosophical thoughts only from their authors. Anyone who feels driven to philosophy needs to seek out its immortal teachers in the quiet sanctuary of their works. The main chapters of any one of these true philosophers will provide 100 times more insight into that philosopher's teachings than the sluggish and cross-eyed accounts of those doctrines that are put out by ordinary minds who, in addition, are generally deeply enmeshed in whatever philosophy is currently in fashion or in their own pet opinions. But it is amazing how decidedly the public prefers these second-hand descriptions. In fact, an elective affinity seems to be at work here, drawing common natures to what is similar to them, so that they would rather hear from someone like themselves what even a great mind has said. This might be based on the same principle as the system of reciprocal instruction, according to which children learn best from other children. That's still today. Now, one more word for the professors of philosophy. The sagacity, the proper and subtle tact with which they immediately knew that my philosophy was something completely different from, and in fact inimical to, their own efforts and, to use a popular phrase, not their cup of tea, the assured and sharp-witted political instinct that told them exactly what to do with my philosophy, as well as the perfect unanimity with which they did it, and finally the persistence with which they kept it up. I have always admired all this. This procedure they hit upon for dealing with my philosophy, which also has the advantage of being easy to put into effect, consists, as is known, in ignoring it completely and thereby secreting it. Goider's malicious expression, in tag und Geschäfte, which really means holding back what is important and meaningful. This silent treatment is made all the more effective through the corybantic racket with which the birth of the intellectual children of like-minded types is reciprocally celebrated. I'll just get that because I've paused. Dictionary. Corybantic. Corybantic, wild, frenzied. Rock and roll's corybantic gyrations. Corybantic. There we go. From mid-17th century, from corybantes, Latin name for the priests of Cybele, a Phrygian goddess of nature, who performed wild dances, with Greek corybantes. Phrygian, wild, frenzied. Native inhabitants of Phrygian, I should say. Phrygian. There we go. This silent treatment is made all the more effective through the corybantic racket with which the birth of the intellectual children of like-minded types is reciprocally celebrated, and which grabs the public's attention so that they notice how important these types look when they greet each other over these births. Who could mistake the purpose of this procedure? For there can be no objection to the principle, live first, then philosophize. The gentlemen wish to live, and indeed to live by philosophy, and it is to this that they have been referred with their wives and children, and they have dared to do so in spite of Petrarch's poor and naked you walk along philosophy. Petrarch's poor and naked you walk along philosophy. And the songbook. I'll copy that, and I'll just go out to the old Google and I'll just paste it. And then, no, that's not what I copied. Petrarch's. Copy. Paste. Oh, what do you mean you got no paste and search? Bookshop? No bookstore? No, we'll just say Petrarch. Petrarch Francesco Petrarca, 1304 to 1374. He lived a long time. Was a pivotal Italian scholar, poet, and diplomat. often called the father of humanism and father of the Renaissance, credited with initiating the Renaissance by rediscovering classic texts, fostering humanist philosophy, and perfecting the sonnet, particularly in his famous love poem to Laura. He established a model for lyric poetry that influenced European literature for centuries and developed the Italian language alongside Dante and Boccaccio. It's an interesting head garland thingy. What is it, an olives? I don't know. What is Petrarca? Okay, so what do we got? Poor and naked, you walk along philosophy. Philosophy is capitalised. So, what do you say? The gentlemen wish to live, and indeed to live by philosophy, and it is to this that they have been referred with their wives and children, and that they have dared to do so in spite of Petrarch's poor and naked, you walk along philosophy. I'll search this. Search this bit. What's that mean? I might ask the bot. I'll ask the bot. See what the bot says about this little section. Bot, explain. In spite of Petrarch's poor and naked, you walk along philosophy. Of Schopenhauer's second preface to the second edition, preface to the second edition as translated in English, translated into English. Explain, and just put quotation marks around that, and this bit as well of Schopenhauer's preface to the second edition as translated into English. Here is a clear explanation of the line. What the line means. Schopenhauer is quoting the Italian Renaissance poet Francesco Petrarch, who once wrote about philosophy. Poor and naked, you walk along philosophy. Italian. Prevera e nuda, or nuda, vai philosophia. Petrarch meant that philosophy is materially poor, socially undervalued, and often stripped of worldly rewards. Philosophers walk through the world without wealth, political power, or public honour. They are outsiders, pursuing truth rather than status. When Schopenhauer invokes this line, he is not agreeing with Petrarch's complaint. Instead, he brings it up to say, even though philosophy is poor and naked, as Petrarch said, it also stands in high honour and is deeply necessary. For Schopenhauer, true philosophy does not need external pomp or institutional respectability. Its value lies in its truth, not in its prestige. Why Schopenhauer cites Petrarch in the preface. In the preface to the second edition of The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer is defending philosophy's dignity against the culture he believes has neglected real philosophical insight in favour of fashionable, academic or professionalised philosophy. He has Kantian epigones in mind, but also Hegelians. epige ones, a less dignified follower or imitator of someone, especially an artist or philosopher. The humdrum compositions of some of Beethoven's epigones, epigony. It's a pigeony, isn't it? Mid-18th century, plurals from French epigonies, Latin epigoni, from Greek epigonoi, those born afterwards based on gignestae, be born. There we go. He has counted epigonies in mind, but also Hegelians. By invoking Petrarch's image of philosophy as a poor, naked wanderer, he is doing two things at once, acknowledging that philosophy lacks worldly recognition. He knows his own work was largely ignored during his lifetime. Philosophy is not glamorous, and the world often does not reward it. To reasserting philosophy's inherent nobility, he implies that philosophy's poverty, its lack of institutional power, is no argument against its truth. Schopenhauer sees himself as part of a tradition, Socrates, the cynics, Petrarch's poor and naked philosophy, where the philosopher's dignity is inward, not bestowed by the world. How this fits with Schopenhauer's larger worldview? This moment is fully consistent with Schopenhauer's broader themes. Authentic philosophy is solitary and suffers neglect. Truth is not adorned. It appears plain, but is profound. The philosopher stands outside social and academic power structures. For him, the world as will and representation may be poor and naked in the marketplace of academic prestige, yet remains more truthful than fashionable systems. In one sentence, Schopenhauer cites Petrarch's poor and naked, you walk along philosophy to acknowledge philosophy's lack of worldly honours while affirming its timeless dignity and his own commitment to truth over popularity. If you want, I can also give you a line-by-line gloss of Schopenhauer's paragraph, a comparison with the original German wording, how this quote resonates with his later essays on the suffering of the philosopher. Which essays are those? Which essays are on the suffering of the philosopher? Let me do that with no eyes. Don't worry, I'm not going to get sidetracked. I just want to know which one's the five. Schopenhauer never wrote an essay literally titled The Suffering of the Philosopher, but several of his essays revolve around the philosopher's loneliness, neglect, poverty, hostility from the world, and the pain of pursuing truth. These function as reflections on a philosopher's suffering. Here are the key ones. On philosophy and the intellect, Perega and Paralipomena. Okay. And the world is World Book 3 and Perega Volume 1 essays. On suffering of the world in the Perega and on thinking for oneself, Perega. On reading books on the university and philosophy, Perega. Sketch of a history of the doctrine of the ideal and the real, Perega. A good way to read these. Okay, I'm not reading that. I'm getting back to it now. The gentlemen wish to live and indeed to live by philosophy, and it is to this that they have been referred with their wives and children, and they have dared to do so in spite of Petrarch's poor and naked, you walk along philosophy. But my philosophy is totally unsuitable for anyone to live by. It is completely devoid of the primary, indispensable prerequisite for the philosophy of a well-paid teacher, a speculative theology, which should and must be the principal theme of all philosophy, in spite of the troublesome Kant with his critique of reason, even if this puts them in the position of always speaking about things they cannot know in the least. In fact, my philosophy never even sets down the fable so cleverly devised by and now so indispensable to the professors of philosophy, the fable of an immediately and absolutely cognizing, intuiting, or apprehending reason. You only need to get the reader to swallow this idea at the very beginning in order to go on as comfortably as you please in a coach and fall, as it were, into the territory beyond the possibility of all experience, a territory Kant completely and forever blocked off to our cognition. There you find precisely those fundamental dogmas of modern Judaical optimistic Christianity immediately revealed and most beautifully arranged. Now, what in the world could my own reckless brooding, unprofitable philosophy have to do with that alma mater, that nourishing mother? Okay. The good, productive university philosophy. My philosophy lacks that essential prerequisite and has no North Star except the truth, the naked, thankless, friendless, and often persecuted truth, and looking neither left nor right, heads towards this alone. University philosophy, on the other hand, burdened with 100 interests and 1,000 considerations, carefully manoeuvres its way, since it will always bear in mind the fear of the Lord, the will of the minister, the tenets of the established church, the wishes of the publisher, the encouragement of the students, the goodwill of colleagues, the course of the day's politics, the momentary inclination of the public, and whatever else. Or, what does my quiet, serious search for truth have in common with the shrill schoolroom bickering of the teacher's desk and benches, which are always fueled by personal aims? In fact, these two types of philosophy are fundamentally different. This is why I brook no compromise, accept no fellowship, and take nobody into account, except perhaps someone who is looking for nothing but the truth. Thus, none of the current philosophical partisans, they all follow their interests, but I have only insights to offer, and ones that do not suit any of them because they are not modelled on any of them. An entirely new age would have to dawn before my philosophy could ever be taught from the teacher's lectern. That would be a fine thing, for a philosophy like this which cannot be lived by, to come out into the open air and even win general admiration. This is why it had to be prevented and had to be opposed to a man. But it is not such an easy game, this disputing and opposing, and it is also dangerous because it calls the public's attention to the matter, and reading my works could spoil the public's taste for the lubrications of philosophy professors. Anyone who has tasted seriousness will lose the taste for jokes, especially jokes of a tedious nature. This is why the system of silence that has been so universally adopted is the only correct system, and I can only advise people to stick with it and to keep it up for as long as it works, namely until ignoring something is taken to imply ignorance of it. Then there will still be just enough time to think the better of it. Meanwhile, everyone is certainly free to pluck a little feather here and there for their own use, since there does not tend to be too oppressive a superfluity of thoughts at home. Superfluity. I don't know. Superfluity. Pronounce your T's, Michelle. Kant will never hear you. An unnecessarily or excessively large amount or number of something. It's like superfluous, right? Superfluity. An unnecessary thing. Stated means superfluous. Late Middle English and Old French, superfluity. From late Latin, superfluitas. From Latin, superfluous, running over, superfluous. It's unnecessary, especially through being made more than enough. Isn't it ironic? When you ask for one and get two? No. Yes. Meanwhile, everyone is certainly free to pluck a little feather here and there for their own use, since there does not tend to be too oppressive a superfluity of thoughts at home. So the system of ignoring and silence can still hold up for quite a while, at least for the span of time that I might have left to live. And this is quite a gain. And if in the meantime an indiscreet voice can occasionally be heard, then it will soon be drowned out by the loud lectures of the professors who know how to talk to the public about very different things and with important looks on their faces. Nonetheless, I advise that the unanimity, the course of the procedure being adhered to somewhat more strictly, and particularly for an eye to be kept on young people. Nonetheless, I advise that the unanimity of the procedure be adhered to somewhat more strictly, and particularly for an eye to be kept on young people who can sometimes be terribly indiscreet. Even so, I cannot guarantee that the commendable procedure can be kept up forever, and I cannot vouch for the final outcome. It is, after all, a tricky business directing the public as good and obedient as the public usually is. Although we almost always see the gorgeouses and the hippiesses in the ascendancy, and although the absurd usually rises to the top, and although it seems impossible for the voice of the individual to ever break through the chorus of the deluders and the deluded. I have not been reading that. I'm trying to read the bloody text message that's come through. Even so, I cannot guarantee that the commendable procedure can be kept up forever, and I cannot vouch for the final outcome. It is, after all, a tricky business, directing the public as good and obedient as the public usually is, although we almost always see the gorgeouses and the hippiesses in the ascendancy, and although the absurd usually rises to the top, and although it seems impossible for the voice of the individual to ever break through the chorus of the deluders and the deluded, nonetheless, genuine works will always have an entirely distinctive, quiet, slow, and powerful effect, and in the end they can be seen rising above the turmoil as if by a miracle, like a balloon that flies up over this planet's thick atmosphere into pure regions, and having arrived there, stays put, and no one can pull it back down again. Written in Frankfurt am Main in February 1844. Gorgias and Hippias are two of the ancient Greek sophists. I had an inkling that might be the case. Preface to the third edition is where I'm going to pause for the moment. And I'll just do that. And I'll trick it and say it works. There we go. So there I have my position, and I'll let you go, YouTube. I know it's a bother. Stop recording.